Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Salcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, LeonGo99. Tony's going to be reading our bad idea for us this week. Tony, what do you have for us?
We're going to be talking about the Unabomber, which is very clearly a bad idea.
Bombing people, blowing them up through the mail is a bad idea, yes. We want to discourage that as strongly as possible.
And we're going to be talking about the motivations and things that would have led to him being created and so on. So there's a lot of bad ideas in here.
Should we talk about the background to start with? Because you really wanted to do a story about MK Ultra, but there was too much quackery out there for you to be able to be sure about the facts.
Yeah, there's still going to be an MK Ultra episode someday. It's just about finding, it's about sorting what's real and what isn't. And there's a lot of people out there that take that too far. Even some of the stuff we're talking about today has a tangential relation to MK Ultra, but it's not quite there. Ted Kaczynski was a man of many skills, both ill and great. He was a math prodigy, an author, a survivalist, and ultimately a mad bomber who would send packages by mail to kill people in an effort to end industrialism and technology. He was also said to carry the scent of sour milk on his person at all times.
Interesting. Oh, I just didn't know that. That's, do we know why? Did he like sour milk? Was he not bathing properly? Did he have
he smelled like sour milk. He just always smelled like... It was something where in the descriptions I was reading, it came up like 6 different times that he smelled like sour milk.
That's so odd. I mean, I've smelled some people, Tony, that were not good smelling. And I know he kind of lived out in a cabin and probably didn't prioritize showering towards the end of his career anyway, but...
Usually there's a variance in the musk.
Yeah, maybe it's genetic.
Known as the Unabomber, which was an FBI designation of him as the University and Airline Bomber, they basically just made an acronym for it out of that, or Unabomb, he operated from 1978 to 1995. At the time, he was the subject of the longest and most expensive FBI investigation in history.
I did not know it went on for that long.
Yeah, it was quite a while. He was very, very clever in not getting caught. Born to Wanda and Theodore, a family of sausage makers, his childhood was mostly normal, except at about 9 months old he had a huge hives outbreak, and apparently this is whenever things started to change for him. He had to be isolated for quite some time, and his mom said that he just became kind of somber and morose after that. Even at 9 months, she saw a huge change in his personality after this point. And she kind of points to this as the moment where things started to go awry with him. And there was also a lot of other social stuff that happened later, but he was just an odd kid to begin with. But in 5th grade, he was tested and had an IQ of 167, which basically puts him on par with Stephen Hawking, Albert Einstein, and people at that level. This would lead to him skipping a grade and also lead to some other issues. He had friends at his grade level and immediately found himself being bullied at this higher level. He was a small kid, and skipping a grade didn't help that. He would say that this was absolutely pivotal in his development because he went from being a leader to this kind of bottom-of-the-barrel crew of people to just basically being at the very, very bottom and not having any sort of social outlets anymore.
Yeah, as a parent myself of a child who could possibly... Honestly, I mean, one of my kids is probably a little bit early in his class anyway. That's one of those weird sort of constant calculations you're making of, okay, he's academically gifted, you don't want him to be bored in class, you don't also want him to be the runt physically, although my kids are giants, so that's not quite so much.
It's more for your kids, it would be like, are they emotionally ready to be dealing with the next level up of kids?
Yes, that's very true. I literally just had this discussion with my wife about my son, who is academically in K4. Okay, let's not go off the chain here, but he's pretty gifted as a K4 person.
Yeah.
But man, he's not emotionally equipped at all. He was laying on the floor of the bathroom naked, kicking and screaming about how he didn't want to put his clothes on yesterday. So
yeah, maybe just let that sit for a little bit.
We're just gonna let him go with the normal. Maybe hold him back even a year, not because he's stupid, just to let him mature. We'll see.
Yeah. Kaczynski was accepted into Harvard at 16 and would be attending at 17. Some of the people from his math club in high school said that he just was not ready for this. He didn't even have a driver's license before just being shipped out to Harvard. They actually did take this into account. Instead of shoving him into a normal dorm, they put him into a special building that was for these younger gifted students coming up. But apparently he basically just locked himself in his room, was completely messy, and nobody ever really talked to him all that much. This is where things get really sketchy. As a sophomore, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as purposely brutalizing psychological experiments, led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. Murray was considered the foremost expert in personality analysis, brainwashing, and interrogation techniques. In World War II, he was part of the OSS intelligence agency, which was the predecessor to the modern CIA. He specifically designed experiments to break down personalities. Subjects were told they would be debating their personal philosophy with fellow students, and were asked to write essays detailing their personal beliefs, aspirations, and dreams. It was supposed to be a simple analysis of personal philosophy discussed only with other students. Instead, these essays were turned over to an anonymous defense attorney, who in later sessions would confront and belittle the subject, making vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive attacks using the content of the essays as ammunition, while electrodes monitored the subject's psychological reactions. They were put under bright lights and grilled by lawyers for hours at a time. These encounters were filmed, and subjects' expressions of anger and rage were played back to them over and over and over again. And basically, they were forced to look at themselves in these moments of impotent rage, and just have to keep on dealing with that, time and time again. The experiment lasted 3 years, with someone verbally abusing and humiliating Kaczynski each week for over 200 hours of total study time.
Was he getting paid for this?
He was getting paid a little bit for it.
This doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you keep doing for 3 years.
Yeah, that's what I kept on trying to figure out. It's like, why did he keep going back? Like, if I went to one of those, I would be like, well, I'm done. You guys can shove your studies far up where, et cetera, et cetera. But it's so weird that he kept going back to that, and that they kept on running this.
There was a lot of sketchy studies at the time. I mean, we talked about this is the 60s, right? So
this is like 60s and 70s, so it's like Harvard prison or Stanford prison experiment, all sorts of stuff going on like that.
Teaching dolphins to speak English. At least that one wasn't berating people nonstop and seeing what would happen. You know, you'd think we could figure out what would happen if you just take somebody and nonstop tell them that they suck. Probably not great things.
Yeah, definitely not. Kaczynski's lawyers later attributed his hostility towards mind control techniques to his participation in this study. Some sources have suggested that Murray's experiments were part of the Project MK-Ultra, the Central Intelligence Agency's research into mind control. Chase and others have also suggested that this experience was the main thing that motivated Kaczynski to seek revenge. From my research, I couldn't find any direct connections between Kaczynski's involvement in MK-Ultra and like the LSD testing and some of the other mind brainwashing experiments that the CIA was trying to run. Like, it didn't go into like the super deep kind of violent type experiments that they got into in those projects. But Harvard sealed all the records once Kaczynski's trial started, so we don't have any details there anymore.
So the records exist. They were present at the trial, or did Harvard seal them so nobody could see them once he was on trial and use them as evidence?
I think it was actually shortly before the trial started, Harvard decided to seal them because they didn't want any sort of like culpability or responsibility for what happened.
And lawyers and people of that nature couldn't get a hold of those things as evidence, or is it
They
just not available to the public?
It's not available to the public. They discussed a lot of this stuff in the trial, but the trial would end up being like a kind of a large plea bargain agreement and a lot of other things. So it didn't end up spending that much time in trial. Despite this, Kaczynski continued to be a mathematical prodigy, earning his degree, then moving on to earn a master's and a doctorate from the University of Michigan. Kaczynski's dissertation, Boundary Functions, won the Sumner B. Myers Prize, which basically meant it was the best mathematics dissertation of the year. His dissertation was said to have been absolutely brilliant and maybe that 10 or 12 people in the academic world could understand the work. At 23, he was accepted to be a professor at Berkeley. It wasn't a great fit considering this college was a political activism hotbed, especially on the left side, and he was very much a staunch right-wing type person. He was widely disliked by his students, according to the reviews that they left. He would teach word for word from a book and not answer questions from any of the students. He was just a very, very kind of poorly equipped professor.
Yeah, it seems like the reverse of the "those who can't do teach" mantra. This guy could do, but man, it doesn't sound like he could teach.
Yeah, they should have just like basically set him up somewhere with a whiteboard and just let him go for however long he wanted, and not have to worry about the personal side of things.
You gotta work for that, though, right? Like that, you get that as a professor after, enduring some years of standing there and lecturing and doing the annoying stuff. Eventually, you get teacher's assistants that can do all your work and you're tenured. You don't start out just because you wrote a cool paper like, well, we're just going to give you all the money. Don't worry about doing any work.
Yep, and this was part of the reason why at 26 he resigned from Berkeley without any sort of warning. Some say that he was dealing with a psychotic break, but it was really because he had saved enough money to buy a cabin in the woods. In the previous few years, he decided that he basically wanted to completely get away from everybody and just live an isolated life off the land, and he finally had enough money that he was able to do that. He went to Montana and built his 10-foot by 12-foot cabin in the woods.
And that was the end, and he lived happily ever after, and, he was happy because he was by himself, and his students were happy because they got a better professor.
Oh, I mean, he would live here for the next 35 years. But it also wasn't as isolated as people made it out to be, as you could hear traffic from his yard, and there were like a fair amount of roads, and you could ride a bike into town and so on. But it still was fairly isolated. It didn't have running water or electricity, and actually now this cabin is on display in a museum in Washington, D.C. I think it's the Smithsonian, but I'm not 100% sure.
The Smithsonian is a lot of museums in Washington, D.C., so that's a pretty good guess, Tony.
At this point, he would begin living off of income from some odd jobs at places like a foam rubber factory, and money from his parents. He tried to buy land in Canada, but he received a rejection letter for the land purchase. And also, this was a weird thing where his brother said whenever he received that rejection, he just kind of like dropped the paper and started talking about revenge. Like, there was just a lot of revenge brewing in here. And there's some interesting psychological stuff that started happening in his 20s as well, where he thought he needed to have gender reassignment surgery. He thought that there was just a lot of resentment towards so many people, and he started actually having murderous thoughts. He went to see a psychologist, and the only time he felt better in some of these psychology meetings was whenever he considered murdering the psychologist.
Sounds like this guy has a legitimate problem with authority.
Yes, very, very much so.
I mean, not legitimate in the sense that he needed to kill people and that, like, we have his legitimate problem.
Was justified. Yeah. No, he legitimately needed help. Yes. His goal at this cabin was to become self-sufficient. He began to learn survival skills like plant identification, foraging, organic farming, as well as some hunting. He got around on an old bike. Locals there said that he actually wasn't that unusual compared to most of the rural residents of Lincoln, Montana. It's like one of those areas where it's a lot of the man-on-the-land sovereign citizen types. As he is trying to be isolated, the world encroached around him. He went to his favorite secluded spot and found it was completely destroyed by a road. He had hiked the hard way for a full 2 days to find this spot, and on the plateau, like the entire vista was basically ruined by this road going right through the middle of it. In his journal, he would write, "It was from that point on I decided that rather than trying to acquire further wilderness skills, I'd work on getting back at the system. I certainly don't claim to be an altruist acting for the good or whatever that is, or for the human race. I'd act merely for revenge. On the whole, the scientific and bureaucratic establishment, not to mention communists and others who threaten freedom, but that being impossible, I have to content myself with a little revenge."
I mean, I get that, like, it's your favorite spot and there's a road there, but I don't know that that's a justifiable response. Find a different spot.
Yeah, for sure. It's like you're in Montana. There's still lots of pristine wilderness.
Oh, there was those 2 days of hiking where there was no road, and then you got to the place where you were going, and you're like, I don't like this anymore. There's a road here.
It's a pretty flimsy justification, but that was the actual turning point for him.
It's almost like this guy has something wrong with him, Tony. I'm starting to think he's not a normal dude.
When they found these journals in his cabin, he had written more than 30,000 pages, a good portion of which was written in a mathematical code that cryptologists said rivaled the Enigma machine the Germans used in World War II. Unfortunately for him, he also just left the key sitting on the table, so he basically made this giant code and it didn't matter.
Let's
see. At this point, he started his scheme to kill scientists, businessmen, government officials, and anyone else who pushed supposed human progress. He labeled it the techno-industrial system. He simply wanted to kill people and use this as his justification. In 1978, he decided to send out his first bomb, investigators say that he found his victims through random directories for colleges and sometimes phone books. His first victim would be an engineering professor at Northwestern University named Buckley Christ. He placed the bomb at the University of Chicago with the return address of Buckley Christ, at which point it was returned to the sender. Christ noticed that the handwriting wasn't his, so he called campus police. The package would be opened by a security guard named Terry Maker, and it would severely injure his hand. Apparently the guard quipped, "Maybe it's a bomb." And that quip got said at least 4 or 5 times whenever people picked up bombs, and it turned out to actually be bombs. Like, it was weird how often that actually happened in the Unabomber story. Everybody thinks they're being funny, and it turns out that it actually was a bomb.
Well, I mean, let's be fair to them. A, first of all, they got probably blown up a little bit, and B, you don't encounter that many bombs in your life, so it's not really an actual viable hypothesis for most situations.
After doing the research on this, I was driving this morning, and there was a backpack next to the dumpster in my apartment complex, and I was like, "Is that a bomb?" Like, it was just one of those things where it got into my head. I spent too much time in this. It's like, no, that backpack is not a bomb. Why would it be there? But anyway. The bomb itself wasn't as powerful because of the nature of the build. Most of these were completely handmade with untraceable materials, just scraps of cardboard and pieces of wood from here and there. The switches were made of hickory and other woods. The batteries were scraped clean and the nails were recovered from all around, so they couldn't even pick out which hardware store they were picked up. The boxes were always wood. They kind of looked like cigar-style boxes.
What kind of accelerant did he use?
It actually varied. Sometimes it was just a gasoline bomb. Sometimes it was ammonium nitrate and various other standard bomb-making materials.
Okay. So the stuff you can buy from the store, despite it being untraceable, is usually not great for killing people, especially in that size of a bomb.
It's not super concentrated, and it's also there's just some hurdles there whenever you're trying to make a bomb like that. And this was also at a time whenever you don't really have the internet to try to sort out a bunch of details and throw up your proxy and find all sorts of bad things you can do. He was a little bit limited in his knowledge there to just the chemistry books he was able to check out. Most of his bombs actually wouldn't kill. The scarring became part of his MO. He wanted to inspire fear, and he would only kill 3 and maim about 23 people. In 1979, he decided to up his attacks. He targeted an American Airlines flight where he rigged a barometer to blow up at 35,000 feet. He sent it through airmail so he wouldn't even have to actually get it on the plane himself. Thankfully, this didn't work. It filled the cabin with smoke, and an emergency landing was made. Explosives experts said that it would have absolutely obliterated the plane had it gone off properly. A lot of times, the mistakes he made was he actually filled the canisters too much, so there wasn't enough of an oxygen accelerant. So this was just a little bit of the amateur bomb making that he was doing. I don't know if he was really testing his bombs very much out in Montana.
Yeah, take notes, kids. Make sure you leave a little space for the oxygen when you're building a bomb.
Yeah, let's not talk down that path too long before they end up pulling our podcast off. This is when the FBI and the ATF got involved. The task force would grow to more than 150 full-time investigators. Over the next 17 years, they would put 15,000 suspects into their database and follow lots of meticulous hints and clues trying to figure out who this was. But because the way he was doing the shipping, where it would usually go to a return sender, and all of these other things that just threw people off the path, it was very hard to actually get a beat on who Ted was. In 1980, he switched up his style and rigged a few books to explode. He sent it in Sloan Wilson's Ice Brothers book, and this was because of the Arbor publisher. It was sent to the president of United Airlines. And you'll notice this with a lot of the things he was going for, people with the last name Wood would get targeted, and anything that was related to nature, he would target them just slightly more. He also started to leave false clues inside the bombs and try to take the heat off them. Stamped initials of FC that meant Freedom Club. Some random notes that were found in the unexploded bombs that said, "I told you it would work," and then initials of a former colleague trying to implicate them.
Oh, that's not too smart, Ted. You still got a chain of association there. The FBI's not that dumb.
Somehow that didn't do anything for the FBI. The FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit analyzed the Unabomber and determined that he would be extremely intelligent, connected with academia, and there were several other traits that were on the mark. However, they decided that he would probably be an airline mechanic or somebody that worked with their hands, and that deviated from the model of an outdoorsman, so they weren't really looking for some guy out in the woods. I don't want to go into detail for all the bombs that he planted, because I think there was like 16 or something like that. It might have actually been more. We don't have hours to go through all that. I will say that the USPS actually ended up delivering bombs to the wrong people, because the return to sender scheme didn't always work. Sometimes they didn't check to see if postage was actually paid, and they just brought it to the random person. So it would end up targeting a lot of like secretaries and random people not associated with the technological elite that he wanted to murder. So there was just a lot of injuries to people that were very, very random. Oddly enough, at this point, the media wasn't going as hard after him as you would think. Like they had Richard Ramirez, and they had a lot of other killers that they were very focused on, but they didn't follow the Unabomber near as much.
Well, you said his active period was over 25 years, right?
Yeah, and there were a couple times where he'd take like a 3-year break or a 6-year break, like in the middle of all this.
Right.
Like
in the course of 25 years, if you've got 16 bombs, that's interesting. But like, how much fervor can you gather up for that? Like, the odds of you being killed by this guy are terrible anyway. Like, the human side of it is just like, well, this is a weird thing. So I can understand from the news side of things, probably other things to focus on until one actually shows up, and then you're back on and there's another one of these weird bombs.
Yeah, not to mention it wasn't until 1985 that he actually killed somebody.
Yeah.
Hugh Scruton went to pick up trash in the parking lot of his computer store, and he was the first fatality of the Unabomber. It blew up, and basically at this point, instead of just putting like little nails in, he had started adding razor blades and tons of other things. He had gotten the accelerant a little bit better, and it was a lot rougher for the people that got hit after this point. This is also around the time whenever the sketch for the Unabomber came out. Like, I'm sure most people have seen that picture where it's just a sketch, the giant glasses. Like, it's not really giving anything up, but it's kind of a sinister picture. And I'm sure it'll be on the thumbnail for this episode on YouTube. But this was because the only witness to the Unabomber at any point during his entire stretch came from a secretary who was watching from across the parking lot as a guy came and just dropped a box. She didn't really think much of it, but as she watched her boss, Gary Wright, walk up, he kicked the box, and as soon as he kicked it, the bomb blew up.
So she sees this guy drop something, it blows up as she's watching, so she knows, well, that guy's probably at least associated.
Yeah, like that was where they first started getting it. And then the final 2 bombs would also be deadly. In 1994, Burson Marsteller executive Thomas Moser was killed by a mail bomb sent to his home in North Caldwell, New Jersey. In a letter to the New York Times, Kaczynski said he blew up Thomas because they helped Exxon clean up their public image after the Exxon Valdez incident. More importantly, because its business is the development of techniques for manipulating people's attitudes. So pretty much targeting someone who was trying to brainwash the general public is why he targeted that person.
I mean, that's one way to think about advertising, I guess. I heard a radio show over the weekend that was talking about election manipulation, and it was this weird moment where I was just like, well, that's just advertising. Like, arguing with people is not election manipulation. I mean, I technically, I guess, if I give you my idea and I present it well, I'm manipulating your mind, but, like, that's not illegal.
His last victim was in April 1995, where he killed timber lobbyist Gilbert Murray. This happened 4 days after the Oklahoma City bombing, and apparently this made Kaczynski very jealous. He thought he was the ultimate bomber in America, but in one move, Timothy McVeigh had outdone him by quite a lot.
Wow. For some reason, this fact right here is more telling than, like, anything I've heard about this guy. The fact that he's jealous of the death toll, like, how dare he?
It was a pretty hefty death toll, too.
I know. It was
like 130 people?
7? Okay. Might have been 130. It was a lot. It was...
My great aunt was in that. She was in the building across the street and had glass fragments in her face till the day she died.
It's not like he couldn't be happy for him, right? He couldn't say, all right, another soldier in the weird blowing people up fight. No, it had to be, he's doing more than me. How dare he?
Like he's exacting more revenge than I. This is when Ted changes his tactic and reveals his manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future. It begins with the assertion, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. The New York Times and Washington Post would end up publishing the 35,000-word essay verbatim. And this was because he basically blackmailed them. He said that if they didn't publish this, he was going to keep on bombing. If they published it, he would completely stop his campaign. So they decided that they were going to do that. And it was decided as well because Attorney General Janet Reno and many others thought that it would help identify the bomber.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard, that they had said to them, listen, maybe if we get this guy talking, he'll reveal something about himself and we'll get more of a beat on where he's at and who he is.
And ultimately, that would be the thing that got him caught. But there was an interesting little debate over who got to publish the material, because the people that jumped up immediately to do it was Penthouse. Penthouse dove at the opportunity, and after that leaked that they were going to put that out, Kaczynski sent another letter to these organizations saying that if Penthouse published it, he wanted a more prestigious publisher, and he reserved the right to one more bombing if it was Penthouse that did it.
That's such a... This guy's weird, Tony. This guy who's sending bombs to people and blowing them up, I think there might be something wrong with him.
And if you go and read his manifesto, it's very dry, but it's well written, like better than you would expect most manifestos to be written as far as like grammatically and just well put together, but it's a little bit dry. Kaczynski writes that technology has had a destabilizing effect on society, has made life unfulfilling, and has caused widespread psychological suffering. He argues that because of technological advances, most people spend their time engaged in useless pursuits he calls surrogate activities, where people strive towards artificial goals, including scientific work, consumption of entertainment, and the following of sports teams. He predicts that further technological advances will lead to extensive human genetic engineering, and that human beings will be adjusted to meet the needs of social systems rather than vice versa. He believes that technological progress can be stopped, unlike some people who he says understand some of its negative effects, yet passively accept it as inevitable. He just wanted people to return to their wild nature.
Okay. I mean, like anything, there's at least a kernel of truth in the idea that maybe you shouldn't give your life over to things like, games or, and consider why you're pursuing what you're pursuing. I don't think it's technology that causes us to do badly at that, though. Like, people were into sports way before, the transistor was invented.
It's like almost every civilization has had some form of sports activity, and people have always been down for it. In the end, his idea boiled down to this, that technology dilutes individualism, and if we continue on the path, we're going to find ourselves in a techno-dictatorship. His ideas were actually pretty well received by people at the time, even if his methods weren't. Of course, it did lapse into a few diatribes against leftists, homosexuals, and things of that nature, but what raving lunatic in the woods doesn't do that on occasion? Many philosophers felt that his manifesto was no more extreme than that of Karl Marx and others in that vein. When the manifesto was released, someone did in fact recognize the writing style. Ted Kaczynski's brother David, who was estranged from him, recognized a weird saying that his mother and brother had both adopted. Instead of saying that you can't have your cake and eat it too, Ted said you can't eat your cake and have it too. And at one point that appeared in the manifesto, and that's whenever he started to suspect. David Kaczynski would end up hiring a private investigator as well as a CSI person to analyze letters that Ted had sent him, and they determined that it indeed was him. He hired a lawyer, and they contacted the FBI. David was very insistent that they do this very carefully. The FBI and the ATF had just, in the past couple of years, had Waco and Ruby Ridge happen, so he wanted to make sure that his brother didn't fall into some sort of thing like that, or that he didn't end up just setting off a bomb and killing himself. So the FBI began to infiltrate Lincoln, Montana, and people began to notice that mountain men that wear far too fancy of clothes and didn't quite understand rural lingo were coming into town. And they stalked the cabin for many, many days without Ted leaving it, and eventually they had a ranger come out to talk about a land dispute, which is basically a trigger word for Ted, and they finally got him outside and arrested him without incident.
Well, good on them, I guess, for being careful.
Especially because if you're talking about someone like this, he could easily have a house ready to blow. This is just what he did with his time. I don't think they actually found many traps. They did find a bomb and a partially built other bomb, which kind of shows he wasn't ready to just give up on the whole Unabomber thing, despite them publishing his essays. But he didn't have the entire house rigged to explode like they feared. But it's good to take that precaution.
Oh, absolutely. I was thinking it's touching. I don't know exactly. I assume he did something terrible or just yelled at his brother or whatever and pushed him away. But even there, like, the ties of family were enough for him to really want to encourage the law enforcement officials to treat his brother as humanely as you can treat a person who's trying to blow people up, and give him a fair trial and all that stuff.
Well, it sounded like the main reason he was estranged from his brother was that he was a little bit jealous of his marriage. Ted was never really able to have that sort of contact with a woman, and it was something that he was jealous of. And after his brother got married, he just kind of stopped talking to him. For a brief time, the FBI thought that he might have also been the Zodiac killer because of how good the coding on his journals were, but then whenever they cracked some of that stuff, they realized that really wasn't his way of operating.
That would have been wild, though.
Yeah, if he ended up being both at the same time, that would be fascinating. To get him out of a death penalty plea, Ted's defense wanted to go for an insanity plea, but Ted really didn't want that. So he basically tried to kill himself, fired his lawyers, and a lot of other things happened in succession, and the judge decided that he really was not competent to defend himself. They plead down and basically got him to admit to 3 murders and 10 counts of sending a bomb through the mail. He's spending 8 consecutive life sentences at the Supermax in Colorado. Currently, he's 77 years old and maintains a huge amount of correspondence with people around the country. Pretty much, he tries to respond to anybody that writes to him.
Well, I guess he's keeping busy, and that's good.
And using the mail for what it's properly meant for?
Yeah. I don't want to make light of this. It's a fascinating story, and in some sense, you think of a person like this almost as a character, like in a movie or a book, and he's not, and neither were the people who he killed, right? And I mean, you don't want to say anything that would ever mitigate the fact that this guy was trying to kill people, but I do wonder what he is like now, if he would go back and do things differently, if he's still as crazy and interested in destruction as he once was.
It's interesting to me that like a guy who went from being so not social has actually found a very, very strong social circle in which like some of the people that were responding to stuff. I was reading an Atlantic article, and the guy was saying that it was hard to keep up with Ted because he would send you multiple letters like in a week before you really had time to respond to anything. Like he was just constantly sending letters out and actually built up this social circle and kind of liked the attention that he was getting after that point.
Yeah, I was afraid of that too.
If he would have been able to find some of those people while he was like in his college years or something like that, they might have been able to keep some of that stuff at bay.
One of the things I was thinking about earlier on that same vein is I wonder what this guy would have been like today in the age of Reddit and 4chan and Twitter and places that he could spout crazy-ish ideas. And not all of his ideas were crazy. It's just the way he went about implementing his idea. Like, I don't agree about technology turning us into zombies. I think that we're doing that on our own without, like, this is not a cell phone thing, guys, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But, like, you know, it's fine to have that idea as long as you're not blowing people up over it.
Yeah, it's like there's just so many better ways of doing it, especially whenever he had a mind that could have literally changed mathematics as we know it. Like, he was 23 years old and he was still putting out stuff that nobody had ever thought of before. And instead he just kind of got lost.
He wasted his life. He could have applied it to so much better things and actually made the world a better place. If he was wanting to argue for things to be better, he could have done so much more by being an advocate for nature or by being active in the local politics or the government in some way and using his clout as somebody who's not an idiot, demonstrably so, to try to get things changed at least a little bit for the better, and he probably would have had more impact.
Yeah, and it's like he seemed like the type of guy who had the mind to actually be able to do that. Maybe not the charisma, but he could have done great things. But I think that's all I've got for the Unabomber today. Otherwise, we could end up making this like a 2-hour episode of weird details about him. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes. It's the best way to support us. And we at the $5 tier, we have new pins that are being sent out right now. So check those out.
And don't forget, revenge is always a bad idea.
Pretty much. Occasionally it's probably alright, but most of the time it's a hollow pursuit. Anyway, we will see you guys next week with more bad ideas.
Bye.